Okay, afternoon to no one. So this project, this session is about a project that we are doing it's a 4-country project looking at sub-Saharan Africa, and we've got an audience member. So you can come close and okay. So basically, this project is about building economic complexity in Africa and laying the foundation for expanding economic opportunities for women and youth in Africa. And the main, it's a, yeah, okay. So it's a 4-country team project, and we are it's a 4-country team project, and the idea with this session was for all 4 country teams to present their paper, and then the idea was for me was to introduce the project and sort of its purpose and its context and why we're doing it, and also to speak about the methodology, because we apply the same methodology across all 4 papers. And rather than all 4 speakers, although there's only 2 of us now, speaking about the same methodology, we just sort of do it once, and then they can go into the specifics of each paper. So that's kind of the approach that we want to take. And so that's why I'm speaking first, and I'll speak again looking at the South African case study. Now, I'm just going to introduce the project and then go into the methodology. And then after that, just a quick thing of why we think this is useful. Okay. So, I mean, the title of the project is kind of gives you a good clue into what we're trying to do. It's about building economic complexity in Africa, and in so doing, laying the foundation for opportunities for women and youth to get into employment. The genesis of the project was a paper that myself and my co-authors did, and we actually presented at the previous NJD conference in Washington. And the idea there was we wanted to get an understanding of structural transformation in African countries, especially the post-2000 period, where there's quite a lot of high growth, and but what was that driven by, And then examine manufacturing performance across the continent and explain this performance. And then we applied this economic complexity and product space analytics, drawing on the work of particularly Hausman and Hidalgo, and they got a whole sort of set of papers on this work. This work was presented in various fora, and then we got sort of proposed for some to do this work with the IDRC, and they said, okay, great, go ahead and do it. And the context of this paper is really, okay, you got your African continent, and there's sort of this demographic story which you've heard in the first sort of plenary session in the first day of this conference. You got a lot of African economies that are going to have very large working age growth in their working age populations, and it's sort of saying where you go get jobs. And then also there's sort of limited manufacturing-led structural transformation in the continent. So what we want to do with this project is provide policy options and channels through which African countries can achieve structural transformation in a way that expands economic opportunities for disenfranchised youth and women, particularly focusing on manufacturing and agro-processing. So it's really about, the whole project's got a policy focus to it. So we try and use sort of robust analytics and rigor, but it's really about generating concrete policy options for, particularly the countries that we are interested in. And a large part of the project is presenting this work to local and regional policy forums. Okay. So again, it's 4 countries: Ghana, Kenya, Senegal, and South Africa. Our author for Senegal, he wasn't able to make it. He couldn't get a visa, so he sends his apologies. And Ghana, they weren't really ready to present at this point. But you have the Kenyan and South African case studies. And really what we do is we examine the degree of economic complexity in each of the economies. We locate the country within the product space. This will become clear as we go along. And then we use complexity analytics to identify potential diversification opportunities that will expand manufacturing and agro-processing. And then the next part is like we identify these frontier products, and we conduct firm interviews. So it's a sort of qualitative component to the research. We speak to firms, industry associations, industry experts, and there's two main pieces of information that we're interested from them is, okay, what's the employment potential of these products/industries that we identify? What's the employment potential? And then what's the sort of potential in terms of women and youth being employed in those industries. And then the second component is, and it's very specific to the methodology, is what are the capabilities and constraints that enable expansion into that product. So the whole methodology is built on this idea of productive capabilities. I'll get to that now. But we want to try and identify it at a very detailed product level, and that is going to feed into sort of almost micro policy ideas. So we think that's going to be quite interesting. And then there's two other papers focusing on the services sector and fourth industrial revolution, which just to provide a sort of a more holistic idea of employment and growth in the continent. Okay, so the methodology, I mean, there's a sort of field of economic complexity, and sort of the first sort of work was with Hausman and Hidalgo, but there are other researchers pursuing this, but we sort of focus on the Hausman and Hidalgo's work, specifically seen in the Atlas of Economic Complexity. And really, it's changing the way you think about development. So it's, instead of thinking about development in terms of aggregates, we shift towards the granular. So instead of thinking about GDP or industry level measurements, you're looking at products. It's a shift away from thinking about production being about combining factors of production. Rather, it's now towards this idea of combining knowledge or know-how or productive capabilities. So those three terms, they're all interchangeable, but I'll speak about productive capabilities, and it's bringing all of that together. Well, it's a shift towards thinking about development in terms of that, and they sort of think of development about being the accumulation of productive capabilities, which is expressed in the production of a greater diversity of increasingly complex products. Okay. So what is this productive capabilities? What is it? I mean, that's sort of at the core of their thinking. So what we have here is the wine bottle in the middle there. It's a dessert wine made in South Africa. It's really expensive, and the reason I give this example is that there's various productive capabilities and networks that go into actually getting this final bottle of wine into the retail market. I mean, you need the land, but you also need to know what land to use. You need to know the minerality of the soil, so there's productive know-how in terms of that. In terms of whether you have a labor-intensive or a capital-intensive approach to harvesting your grapes, you've got to be linked to those to the financial markets in order to purchase the capital machinery. You've got to know about the chemicals that you need to use. So there's a certain know-how there and linkages to the firms that actually supply those chemicals, and really what's the effect on the crops. I mean, agriculture's sort of at this level certainly very scientific process. Linkages to capital market or financial markets. There's got to be know-how within the individuals that actually supply the capital. They've got to understand agriculture, and that helps a lot in terms of getting access to the finance that enables this. Logistics networks, and then finally you've got the entrepreneur or the winemaker. The winemaker's got to know what to do. And what's specifically interesting about this bottle is that it's the same bottle of wine that Napoleon Bonaparte talks about. You know, there's documentation of him speaking about this. It's called Vin de Constance. And he speaks about this bottle, and they've got the same recipe and way of producing it. And so that know-how has been passed over time. So all of these things got to come together in order to produce this product. Okay, but capabilities determine the complexity of the economy. So the more capabilities an economy or country has, the more complex that economy. But there's no method of measuring productive knowledge. We can't actually measure it, and therefore they take an indirect approach where they look at what countries make, and from this they infer what countries know. Okay, so they use the easiest way to do this is look at trade data, because there you've got a wider range of countries and you see exactly what products they make, and at a very detailed level you've got the HS6 level or the HS4 level, whichever you choose. And they use this method called the method of reflections, which is an iterative procedure, and it involves the following equations. But really what you're getting at is you're looking at the diversity of, so at a country level, if you're trying to get to the complexity of a country, you look at diversity as a starting point. So what is the number of products that country produces? So what's the diversity or range of products that it produces? And the more products that it produces, well, you got to think that the more productive capabilities it has. You know, in order to produce a greater range, you've got to have a greater range of capabilities. So that's the starting point. But if you want to look at the complexity of the products, you've got to think, well, you look at the ubiquity of those products. By that we mean products that are highly ubiquitous, many countries are able to make. And what you're saying there is that if many countries can make this product, it means that the capabilities embedded in that product are fairly common and not really complex, or it's widely and easily obtained. Whereas if only a few countries can produce a product, it suggests that the capabilities inherent in that product are very specialized. For instance, X-ray machines. Only 2 countries in the world produce those and export those, and that's the US and Switzerland. And that suggests that product's highly complex. Okay, so that's the starting point, diversity and ubiquity. But there's a problem. For instance, if you take ubiquity, say you look at diamonds. Okay, not many countries produce diamonds, but we know that diamonds is not a really complex product. Just intuitively, it's not. You know, you pull it out of the ground. So you need to correct that information because it's not an ubiquitous product. You need to correct it with diversity information. So what you start doing there is you say, what is the diversity of the countries that produce diamonds or produce and export diamonds? And you'll find that the diversity of those countries is quite low. Okay, so you use that diversity information to correct the ubiquity information. Alternatively, if you think of the diversity point, you can have 2 countries that produce the same number of products, so they're equal in terms of diversity. For instance, you have Switzerland and Pakistan, and they produce sort of the same number of manufactured products with a revealed comparative advantage. That's a caveat there. But we know, intuitively we would assume that Switzerland's a more complex economy than Pakistan. So what you have to do is correct that diversity information with ubiquity information. So then you take the average ubiquity of the products that both those countries make. So, can I do this? Okay. So if you look at this graph, it's basically graphing the diversity of these countries against the average ubiquity of the products that those countries export. And you see CHE over there. So it's the blue dots at the bottom. If you take 200 and you go up, there's CHE, that's Switzerland. And if you go a little further, you'd see Pakistan a little further up. So their diversity is the same, but the average ubiquity of what they produce is very different. The average ubiquity of the products that Switzerland produce is much lower than that of Pakistan. So you correct. Okay. Technology. So you use that ubiquity information to correct the diversity information, and you start getting at a more accurate measure of the complexity of the country and the complexity of the product. And I mean, there's a sort of large amount of math behind this, but it's basically this iterative procedure where you're correcting ubiquity information with diversity, and you're going back and forth, and eventually you get into a sort of an index for each country and for each product. Okay, so what we have here is the economic complexity index for all of these countries, and the log of GDP per capita, so a sort of indication of the level of development of those countries. And I group them according to their level of income. So the blue dots are your high income countries. Okay. The light blue squares are high income non-OECD. Triangles are middle income. And then the circles are African countries. And basically you see that as you, there's sort of strong correlation between level of development and economic complexity. And Hausman goes into this a bit more, and they sort of find a very strong correlation, and they sort of do a whole lot of stuff substantiating that. Interesting, you see some countries like Libya, Angola, Gabon that have relatively high GDP per capita, but their complexity is quite low. And that's really because these are oil-producing states, and that sort of pushes up their GDP per capita. But really, if you look at their export data, there's sort of one product being petroleum, or a bit more, but mainly just petroleum. Okay, so how do you grow complexity? And if you want to grow complexity, you've got to diversify your productive structure, you've got to produce more products. But in order to do that, you need to accumulate capabilities. But the problem here is there's this chicken and egg issue. So with the chicken and egg issue is basically, if you want to produce a new product, you've got to accumulate those capabilities that enables you to produce that product. But if there's no demand for that product, there's no need to or incentive to accumulate the capabilities. So you just have this sort of situation, what must come first? And so what Hausman and the co-authors sort of say is that, well, when countries are looking to diversify, they think about what's the closest product. Now, what we mean by that is they mean by what is the closest product in terms of capabilities. So countries tend, and there's work where they sort of substantiate this claim, but countries tend to diversify into products where the capabilities in those new products overlap with the capabilities embedded in their current productive structure. So there's some sort of overlap. They've got some of those capabilities, and the jump to the next product is a little bit easier because they already have some of the productive capabilities, and they just need to get a few more to make that jump. Okay? So in a sort of intuitive sense, it's easier to jump from shirts to blouses as opposed to from shirts to jet engines, because the productive capabilities inherent or embedded in shirts and blouses are quite similar, whereas the productive capabilities embedded in shirts and jet engines are quite dissimilar, and that makes that jump a lot harder. Okay, so again, the problem is we don't observe capabilities directly, and so you need to measure this. Measuring the similarity and capability requirements of different products is not a simple process. So they create a measure that infers the similarity between capabilities required by a pair of products by looking at the probability that those products are co-exported. So if there's product A and product B, if two or more of the same countries export both product A and B, then product A and B are relatively close. Or put another way, the capabilities inherent in both those products are quite similar. But if you don't have that's co-exporting, then the capabilities between two products are relatively dissimilar. the key assumption is that if two products share most of the requisite capabilities, the countries that export the one will also export the other. Relatedly, if the two products do not share many capabilities, then they are less likely to be co-exported. And they basically generate this sort of proximity matrix between all of the products, well, trade data products. And then they use that to generate this product-to-product network that they use sort of in network analytics to generate a product space. And I don't know, some people are familiar with this, but it's really, there's a couple of points here. Each of the circles is a node, and that represents a product. Each of the lines, or called links, represent those. So that's motor vehicles, and that's motor vehicle parts. Now, there's a strong link there. You see that connector? That suggests that the countries that export motor vehicles typically also export motor vehicle parts. Okay, so that's, and what you see is there's a characteristic of this product space is that you get a periphery, and then you get a core, and you get these clusters. So this over here is electronics, this is chemicals, this is machinery, clothing, construction, and then, okay, that's oil over there. So that's really a disconnected product that's very far from anything else. And most of the products on the periphery are typically natural resource-based products. Okay, so there's a couple of interesting things about this that we can talk about in terms of manufacturing. So so we distinguish between core and peripheral, and the core products are highly connected. What we mean by that is that if you produce motor vehicles or motor vehicle parts, there's a lot of other machinery products that you can shift into quite easily. So this sort of space over here, there's lots of other options or other products whose productive capabilities are very similar to those in motor vehicle parts, for instance. Okay, so if a country has a lot of occupied nodes in the core, then the neighboring products differ in few of the requisite capabilities, and it's easier to diversify by accumulating the few missing capabilities. Okay, and it's easier to grow complexity. And the assumption there, and it sort of comes out, is that the products in the core are typically manufactured products, and they're typically more complex than products in the periphery, which are typically resource-based or primary products or resource-based products, which are typically less complex. What this means is that if a country has some occupied nodes in the core of these product spaces, it's relatively easier to diversify their manufacturing. Whereas if they occupy nodes in the periphery, it's a lot harder to diversify into manufacturing. Yeah. And what this suggests, which is quite interesting, is that your structural transformation path it's path dependent. So you got to move. You don't just jump from natural resource-based products into sort of advanced machinery or electronics or chemicals. You got to sort of get somewhere in here, and then once you're in manufacturing, once you have the productive capabilities that allow you to produce some sort of manufacturing products, you can start building on that. So start building, moving to increasingly more complex products that are, okay. So this is quite important for the work that we're talking about, is there's other measures that are useful for the complexity analytics, and the one is the distance measure, and that quantifies the distance between the products that a country makes, so the products that a country has a revealed comparative advantage in, and the ones that it does not make. So for each product that a country doesn't make, there's a distance from that product to the sort of the average of all the other products that the country does make. Okay. So that's distance. Opportunity gain is basically what's the opportunity of shifting into I'm just trying to explain these things intuitively, But if you shift into a new product, what are the potential options once you're in that product? Does that new product offer a lot of further diversification options? So it's best to explain in this product space graph. So this is South Africa, and I'm really going to speak to this story here. So this is motor vehicle parts. It's an unoccupied node. It's actually one of the frontier products for South Africa. South Africa currently produces motor vehicles, and this is delivery trucks. Now, this product here, motor vehicles, is relatively complex. So its PCI index is 3.29, which is much higher than South Africa's economic complexity. So that's the average sort of complexity of the economy. So if South Africa shifts into this product, it'll grow its complexity. Secondly, the distance between motor vehicles and motor vehicle parts is relatively close. It's 0.84, that index. So it suggests that it's close, meaning that the productive capabilities embedded in motor vehicles is relatively similar to those embedded in motor vehicle parts. So the jump is relatively easier. Secondly, if you jump into motor vehicle parts, this is the opportunity gain part, these are linkages with other products, and these are typically machinery products. So there's many future diversification options once you get into motor vehicle parts. So that's the opportunity gain of shifting into them. It's relatively high. So it's 1.15, whereas the mean is 0.42 for in the South African case. So that's just sort of graphically what those measures mean. Okay. I'm going to let Manaseh speak about the Kenyan example. I'm just going to skip this section here. I don't want to. And then, so Manaseh is going to speak about the Kenyan case study, and then I'll speak about the South African case study after that. I think maybe we do questions after your case study, and then I'll speak, and then we'll do questions after mine. I think that's good. Otherwise, you just go sit and listen the whole time. And I apologize again. We lost our chair, and we lost one of our co-authors. We didn't lose them; they just didn't get on their flights. So this session is, and I lost my bag on the way here. So there's something going on, but yeah. So I apologize if I'm speaking too much, but I hope.
So thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'll welcome you to our presentation. We are presenting the Kenyan case for building economic complexity as a way of creating employment opportunities for women and youth. A lot has been mentioned about economic complexity and the technicalities surrounding it, the methodology. So my focus will be more on the findings, and what we will be looking at, what employment opportunities are possible to arise out of building economic complexity in the Kenyan economy, given the existing productive capabilities. So this is the outline of my presentation. I'll present our objectives. We'll present, we'll locate the Kenya's productive space. We'll identify frontier products, and then we'll, in this study, because we were looking at, the bottom line was to establish employment opportunities that will be available for women and youth, given the economic complexity of the country. So we'll also present our findings and our policy recommendations. So our objective was to examine Kenya's journey towards structural transformation. We know that structural transformation is the heart of the issue of demographic dividend, where we expect to create so many jobs for the current youth who are likely to get into the job market in the next 20 or so years. So besides that, we want to identify ways through which Kenya can enhance its complexity so that it can create jobs in the manufacturing sector and also in the upstream and downstream markets that are linked to the manufacturing sector. So I'll go straight to looking at economic complexity across countries. This is a comparison across countries. We can see that these are African countries. This is Tanzania. We can see that in this region, it is pretty much a low complexity region. We have Nigeria here. We are comparing complexity to log of GDP per capita. So Nigeria is here, as explained by Francois. They have a high GDP per capita, but a very low complexity. This is based on the virtue that by the fact that they are more resource-based exporters. We have Ghana, who are also in the same category. And then we have Tanzania, which has a slightly higher complexity than the two countries. And then we have Kenya. Now, in this other section, there are the BRICS. We have India, we have China, we have Brazil. South Africa is also here. They have a relatively higher level of complexity. So you see that their GDP per capita is high, and at the same time they have a higher complexity. This because they produce more complex products, and they have a wider variety of export products. So we want to locate the Kenyan economy within the product space from 1995 to present day. So we are trying to establish whether there were any changes in Kenya's economic structure in the last 20 years or so. So as was mentioned before, most of the products that are in the periphery are mostly not very complex products, and as you can see, most of our major products are mostly raw materials. You can see coffee. Coffee was a major product since independence. Same for tea. You can see that they are more of in the periphery within the product space. You can see cut flowers, which are a major export commodity to the EU. We have other live plants, which can also be seen to be more towards the periphery. We have flat rolled iron, the same case. So we have very few products within the core that really suggests that our complexity is not so high. So this is 1995, and our total exports were $1.58 billion. Now this onwards to 2015. Well, the same story. We have tea, we still have coffee. We have textiles. There was an improvement, but the transformation was not major. We have other live plants, which are still in the periphery. We produced confectionaries, which is a good sign that we are moving to more complex products. And then there is titanium ore, which is also a major export product, but it is still in the raw form. So what we are seeing is that there is no significant shift from 2016, from 1995 to 2015. Though in terms of the exports, it has grown to $5.27 billion. but structurally there is no much significant change. You can see that the tea, coffee, textile, live plants, and now more recently titanium ore dominate. These are the most dominant export commodities. The others, yes, they exist, but their numbers are not as significant as these ones. So if you look at 1995, you find that they're more or less the same products that we are exporting. So there was really no much significant structural transformation in terms of exports, and that is just one of our findings. So part of this project was to identify employment opportunities based on what we export. What are the employment opportunities that exist for youth and women? Because we are trying to lay a foundation so that we can harness demographic dividend by the year probably 2025 going forward. So after looking at our current product space, we looked at frontier products from the basic from the methodology, and from our calculations, we found that most of the products that had a positive revealed comparative advantage were 177 products. That was in 2015. So most of the Kenyan products with a high revealed comparative advantage had low complexity, as we had seen from this diagram. Most of these are the products that have a revealed comparative advantage, but they have a very low level of complexity. So we also looked at the distance. We looked at opportunity value. We looked at opportunity gain. And these have been explained by Francois at length. So these are basically what will be the gain in moving into these frontier products. What will the economy gain by moving into the frontier products given the current product space and our current production structure. So in looking at the frontier products, we looked at products that would advance the country's economic complexity index, products that are feasible given the current productive knowledge, products that have potential for future diversification, products that would increase employment opportunities for women and youth. And in identifying these frontier products, we whittled them down by looking at our actual exports. So in this way, we were able to eliminate products that are not realistic given our current productive capabilities. For example, from the data and the calculations, it was found that Kenya had aeronautic spare parts as a frontier product. But given the current capabilities, it is not possible for Kenya to produce aeronautic spare parts. So after this process of these considerations were made, we arrived at 64 products that would provide the country with an opportunity to increase its complexity and at the same time create employment opportunities. So after this, we spoke to manufacturing membership associations just to get their views on issues surrounding which areas, what are the issues that would propel them to produce more complex products, and which areas would would move the country from low complexity products to high complexity products. So after this process, from this process, we were able to identify 122 farms based on the products they produce and their geographical locations. And then we also gathered information from the stakeholders, right from manufacturers to the policy implementers, to other stakeholders in a roundtable forum to give us their views on how we would move the country's complexity as a way of creating more employment opportunities. So these are the products that we identified as being currently undertaken by farms, and they correspond with the products that are currently being produced. And from here, we looked at the frontier products that were identified from our calculations and identified from responses by farms and other stakeholders. So using this, we went ahead to the field to talk to farms on which of these products, if were to be produced, would create employment opportunities for women and youth, and what will be the skill requirement, what will be the knowledge and capabilities that was required for this to produce the kind of jobs that we want for the women and youth. So we had already spoken about the farm identification strategy. And then going straight to the study findings, it was established that most of the manufacturing firms were more focused on the domestic market, and very few were focused on the export market. And this is an indicator of the level of complexity, because for exports, it is required that you produce products that are more sophisticated and are more appealing to the outside market. And from this, we are able to see that the share of export revenue is low for most of these firms. And from this situation, it will not be easy to create a lot of employment opportunities. So export destinations, they have a strong relationship with product diversity and ubiquity that had been mentioned. How unique are the products we are producing? And to which destinations would they be marketable? So we find that most of our products are targeted to our neighboring countries. This is East Africa, within the East Africa community, and within the COMESA region. So I'll just move on to the most important findings, because we wanted to see the kind of employment opportunities that will be available for women and youth. So we find that in the manufacturing sector, we have, from the firms that were interviewed, 90% of them employed males. I mean, there were the structure in terms of sex was that 90% of the employees were male, and the rest were female. These were in terms of permanent employees. Then from the interviews, we see that these are the top 10 areas, sectors with employment potential. We see that timber processing ranks very highly. These are wood and wood products. There is glass processing, has quite a number of employment opportunities. Production of pipes and plates, manufacturing of dairy products, block making, manufacturing of paints, and the rest. So we see that from the firms that are interviewed, if they were to move to the frontier products, they would produce a total of 3,562 jobs, which will be a very good achievement for the economy. But what are the skill requirements? We require skills in design, carpentry, mechanical engineering, vet services, information technology, food science, and this one, pyrolysis experts. I don't know what it entails, but it was a response. So, having identified the employment opportunities that are likely to arise, what are the constraints to these employment opportunities? Now, from the manufacturing firms, they gave us these responses. They say that high interest rates were inhibiting capital investments. So it was difficult for firms to move into new investments because of the high interest rates. The current interest rate regime in Kenya is controlled, and for this reason, the banks are holding on to their capital. So it is difficult for firms to access credit to enable them to expand. Now, exchange rate depreciation affects importation of capital goods. These are goods that are important for the manufacturing sector. And on this issue, because of currency depreciation, it's very expensive to import capital goods. Low commodity prices discourage production. This especially for coffee, which was a key export product in the early years, but nowadays it has declined. Now, there are a host of other macroeconomic issues, which due to time I will not discuss. We have other microeconomic issues, firms operating below optimum level for various reasons. And then there is the existence of skills gaps, and then minimum wage requirements. These ones affect the firms at micro level and do not allow them to operate at optimum and create employment opportunities. So these are the constraints. We went ahead and asked them, what constrains you from hiring women and youth? For women, there was the issue of odd working hours, issues of working night shift. It's difficult in the Kenyan context for women. Skills mismatches, especially for fresh graduates. The labor-intensive nature of work affects women employment because they prefer less manual jobs. Lack of experience on part of the youth. They come out of graduate school with the knowledge, yes, but they lack the practical knowledge required for the industry. Lack of technical skills, negative attitude towards manual jobs. And for women again, most employers were saying they would be hesitant to employ women in the manufacturing industry because of issues of maternity and long absence from work. So, to enhance the skills, we recommend investment in technical and vocational training. There needs to be a change of attitude campaigns towards manufacture in the manufacturing sector for the youth, because we need to take up these manual jobs to reduce unemployment. Industrial attachment to be offered for the youth to give them practical experience. In Kenya, it is very difficult to get industrial attachment. It is more easy to get employment than internship or attachment. We also need to enhance linkages between large and small-scale manufacturers to enhance their competence and to increase the quality of the products they produce. So other incentives that were proposed were like tax breaks for companies to hire more women and youth. And last but not least, the government needs to create a conducive environment for industries to create, to operate at optimum and increase employment. This in reference to the macroeconomic environment. So, with those many or few remarks, I wish to thank you for your attention, and we welcome your comments to improve the paper. Thank you.
Okay, any questions? Okay.
So, Manaseh, it seems that some of the barriers to women's employment are discrimination, essentially. And I was wondering if you're familiar with Kenyan legislation on gender-based discrimination and whether it's ever enforced, and have there ever been high-profile cases with respect to that?
Okay, I don't know whether we'll take all the questions. Are there any other questions, or I respond to that one first? Okay. So you are saying that they are more about discrimination. You're asking whether some of these constraints are more of...
So it just, sorry. I'm just asking that whether or not, so something like reluctance to hire a woman because you think she doesn't want to do manual labor, or she might take maternity leave, or she shouldn't be working odd hours, is employment discrimination. Do you not see it that way? That's how it sounds to me. So the question is, what do you know about legislation on employment discrimination? And have you heard of any cases in which it was enforced, if such legislation exists?
Of course, with regards to employment, it is by law, no one should discriminate on basis of gender or all other issues. It should be purely on merit. But now you see, in the hiring process, there is no way to verify that, because these are responses from firm interviews, so they are said in confidence. We are not even able to identify which firm responded in this way.
Right.
So these are the inherent issues that compel firms not to be willing to hire women. But they would not come up front to say that we are not hiring you because of your likelihood to go for maternity leave or any other issue.
Yeah.
But it is the reason why they're not hiring. So that's why you find that 90% of the employees in the manufacturing sector are men. Yeah. So it is not outright, it is not open, but it is something that is there. Yeah. So it is difficult to maybe take legal action on something that is not so outright. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. It was very interesting. My question is more like, I see all these recommendations and they are more like on the supply side and not really on the creation of or developing all these products that you have identified that would increase the competitive advantages of Kenya. So have you thought of any recommendations in terms of how to really focus on those products that you have identified and help transition into that to make the structural change that you're looking for?
Yeah, the major issue is maybe I just did not highlight it due to the interest of time, but the major issue is skills. There's a skills gap in producing complex products, and that is the essence of this study, looking at our knowledge and capabilities. You find that most of the workers, because production is based on the knowledge we have in the workforce. So you find that most of the workers are not, they lack the capability to produce goods that would go out and compete in the global market. So in that regard, we identified the issue of enhancing skills that can actually go out, help us produce products that can go out and be competent in the global market. I hope, yeah.
I just wondered, because you've got obviously these products and you sort of think of all the, I'm just thinking back to the example he gave of the wine and the different production processes that it takes. You know, when you look at something like timber, you might be like, oh, women, maybe the manual process, the women, you know, you think of them hauling the wood and you're like, maybe that's not something they would find desirable or want to do. But is there potential, like within the products that you have identified to, you know, are there divisions of tasks or something that, you know, rather than just say you need the skills to go into timber, maybe it's that there are specific things within these industries that can either the youth or like whether it's ICT or something that they might be more interested in, or the women who would, you know, if only 10% of women are in these industries, it's, you know, it's hard for them to work in such a male-dominated environment. So potentially, as she was saying, like from the side of the firm, maybe the policies need to be on that side too. Like, can you identify first of all in the production process, and maybe it's not really what your study is, but I wondered, like, in terms of linking it to the policy, you've got these sectors that have opportunities, and so maybe we can identify the division of tasks.
Yeah, thank you very much that's a very good question, because I'll give you an example of manufacture of dairy products. These had quite a number of job opportunities, and for most of the manufacturing farms we visited, they said that they require a lot of expertise in the food science, especially the area of pasteurization and quality assurance of the dairy products they produce. So even within the manufacturing itself, I'm sure these ones are more skill intensive. This will be a more skill intensive task than wood products, which is more manual. So this one, in this one lies opportunities for employment of women and even youth, because youth prefer more white collar jobs for some reason, regardless of the current unemployment rate. So with this kind of skills, we'd be in a position to create jobs for women in the manufacturing sector. Now the issue comes into, the issue is availability of training institutions to provide these skills, because sometimes some of these skills are trained on the job. So the challenge is coming up with institutions that can provide such specific skills that can help in the manufacturing process. And I think maybe that will be the way to go in terms of creating employment for women. Yeah.
Okay, I think we...
Yeah.
Okay.
No, I was wondering if you could also talk a little bit about the other country studies that you mentioned, if there is like differences and recommendations or findings you had.
Yeah, I mean, I'll do the South African one. This part here is still ongoing. So we've done sort of the analytical, empirical type stuff, but now it's sort of going and speaking to firms and assimilating that information into something useful. And so I think in my presentation, I'll give you like a very specific example, which I think brings out this idea of capabilities. but it's still ongoing. There's a variety of products that we're still trying to get speaking to firms, which is obviously a challenge. But yeah, hopefully when I speak I can address that. Okay, so. Okay, as promised, I'm back. So time's a little bit more limited, so I'm going to try and get through this. So this is the South African case study. So we've got the 4 countries, and you get the South African version here. But really, there was a few research objectives. Really examine the extent to which South Africa has undergone structural transformation in the post-apartheid period, and then identify avenues through which South African can diversify its export structure, grow in economic complexity, and generate employment opportunities specifically for women and youth, and then obviously to feed into policy. So we all follow a fairly similar approach. Of course, with different flavors, because there's a bit of a country element, and which makes it a bit more interesting. You don't want 4 identical papers, I suppose. Okay, I'm just going to skip that. But just to go to the context. So in South Africa, I mean, unemployment is so the developmental problem, amongst others. High unemployment. This is the official rate, 25.9%. In 2016, and much higher than sort of developing or emerging markets peers. So, I mean, South Africa is really an outlier in that regard. The unemployment rate for women is higher, disproportionately higher, 29%, and the unemployment rate for youth, defined as 15 to 24, is 54%. And your youth who are not in education, employment, and training, that's at 30.5, which is also relatively high. I don't have the comparative graph, but I just want to do. So unemployment's really a big problem in South Africa. So we've got to generate the structural transformation to change that. This graph here is really the sort of Macmillan, Roderick, and Verdasco Gallo structural transformation graph. And really what you have here, change in employment share by each of these industries, or sectors. It's the SIC 1-digit level. And you got the change in employment, so it can either be negative, employment share, or it can be positive. And obviously you draw a line there, dividing negative and positive. And then on the vertical, you got the natural log of sectoral productivity over total productivity. So it's sort of a relative productivity for each of these sectors. And what it does is that it breaks up this graph into 4 quadrants. So over here, if you find an industry in this spot, it's a growing labor share and a relatively high productivity sector, whereas here it's declining labor share and in a high productivity sector, declining labor share in a low productivity sector, and rising labor share in a low productivity sector. And this is South Africa, 1995 to 2016. Not the counterfactual, but the East Asian sort of structural transformation pattern would involve the following. I don't have the graph, and I apologize for that, but you can imagine it. What you'll have, if you look at the typical sort of East Asian story, is you have a large bubble here for agriculture. So similar to South Africa, but a much bigger bubble. So it's a lot of your labor resources leave in low productivity agriculture, and then over here you have a large bubble for manufacturing. So it's a lot of labor resources shifting to high productivity manufacturing, and that sort of would be indicative of manufacturing-led structural transformation. So that would be an sort of East Asian type story if you want to generalize. But in South Africa, I mean, what we have here, okay, we have this sort of exit out of agriculture, low productivity agriculture, but what's happened is most of your labor is shifted to wholesale and retail trade, to domestic work, and to CSP services. So these are all low productivity industries or sectors, and I mean, this over here, wholesale and retail trade, a large chunk of that is actually informal employment. Manufacturing is really just, it's a decline in your labor share, and that's consistent with the sort of deindustrialization of South Africa's of South Africa. Where there has been a growth in high productivity sectors is in finance, although a portion of that is in temporary employment services. It's just the way that they sort of classify your industry, so a large portion of that is not really good jobs. But you don't see in South Africa this manufacturing-led structural transformation. So when we take the complexity analytics, we sort of move away from the sort of aggregate story to a more sort of granular approach. And I'll show you that with the product space graphs next few slides. But just in terms of economic complexity, I mean, I've shown you this graph, and I won't spend too much time on it, but the main story here is just like a relative story in terms of complexity. South Africa's economic complexity index in 2014, it's higher than the aggregate for the Middle East, for Central America, South Asia, North Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa, but it's lower than that for Eastern Europe, East Asia and Pacific, North America, and Europe. Okay, so that's sort of, there's South Africa over there. It's sort of clustered with Costa Rica, Uruguay, Argentina, and Brazil, and Colombia. So that's sort of where South Africa is situated in terms of complexity. But the story is, well, how do you grow this complexity? This graph here it's just really to establish this relationship, or we try to establish it, between economic complexity and sort of manufacturing. And the way that we measure manufacturing is the number of manufactured products exported, obviously, in this case with a revealed comparative advantage of one or more. And you see there's a positive relationship here with a degree of heterogeneity. But the main story there is that it suggests that as countries with more diverse manufacturing sectors tend to be more complex economies. So the idea of growing manufacturing essentially is it's going to, it's similar to, it leads to high levels of complexity. So we can locate South Africa in the product space. This is 1995, and really the story there is peripheral and resource-based. So South Africa has just got a huge amount of value in its soil, which I suspect could be a detriment to its manufacturing sector. But anyway, so we've got platinum, coal, gold, diamonds, and iron, and some iron-related products. Okay. So those are the big sort of exports in 1995. There is a bit of evidence of chemicals, and a little bit of this is centrifuges, and that's sort of other agricultural machinery. So there is, in 1995, there is some evidence of machinery there, but it's really small. Okay. But if we see, okay, well, what happens in 2015? If you have a pattern of structural transformation, manufacturing-led, you would see a greater occupation in these sort of core areas of the product space. There's a little bit of evidence there, but really not much. The product space remains peripheral. You still got your big resource, diamonds and gold and platinum, coal. But there is something happening in terms of sort of, this is agro-processing and horticulture, so sort of value-added agricultural goods. This is motor vehicles, and that's really government subsidies that's driving that, delivery trucks as well. And then chemicals is still sort of chemicals and plastics. So South Africa's productive structure hasn't really changed over that period of time, still remains very resource-based. So in terms of identifying, we followed a similar approach we all followed a similar approach with sort of country-level flavors, but this is how we went about it. And what I do here is I just put this graphic here where I put these are all products that South Africa does not export with the revealed comparative advantage, or it's just a zero in the trade values. And it's within the space of distance and product complexity. And really, I mean, what you get from that is that more complex products are further from your productive structure in terms of the capabilities required. Now, the way that we go about selecting our frontier products is we have a number of criteria. So we think about complexity, we want to grow complexity. So we want to look at products that have a greater complexity or product complexity than South Africa's, like the average, so it's economic complexity. So any products above this horizontal solid line, okay? So we drop all of those. Then we say, well, we want sort of feasibility, and we eliminate all products that have a higher than the median distance of the products in which South Africa does not already have a revealed comparative advantage. So they need to be relatively close. So that dotted vertical line is another cutoff. So we focus on this top left quadrant. That represents the frontier products. Then we drop from here any products that have a zero or negative opportunity value, or opportunity gain. And then we also eliminate products that have decline in shares or decline in markets in the sort of global markets. So, and that sort of gets rid of a lot of products that are sort of remnants of your trade nomenclature. So it's just like a product that's no longer produced actually globally, and you just eliminate that, or it's a change of classifications, or anyway. So it's over here, and then we focus on manufacturing and agro-processing. So if there's any primary products here, we just say no, we're not interested in that. South Africa produces enough primary products, and yeah, so that's how we get to those frontier products. And yeah, I mean, intuitively, this is what we do. And we're saying it's got to be a more complex product, so motor vehicle parts. It's more complex than our ECI. It's got to be relatively close, so the distance from motor vehicle parts from motor vehicles is relatively small. So the capabilities inherent in this product is similar to those needed for motor vehicle parts. So it's feasible in terms of the jump, and then the opportunity gain represented by these red dotted lines suggests that if you jump into here, there's a lot of diversification opportunities that would arise. Okay, and then we wanted to go to a top 20 products. So we got 164 frontier products, but we sort of said, well, let's sort of refine and focus on a few products. And we followed Hausman, Cunningham, Matovu, and Wyatt, and just applied these sort of weightings to these three measures: distance, complexity, and opportunity gain. We weighted them equally, and then we said, okay, let's try the parsimonious transformation weight, which values labor-intensive industries and favors industries that are highly feasible. In that sense, you weight distance more highly relative to complexity and opportunity gain. The strategic bet weight acknowledges more strategic sectors that may be further away in terms of distance, but emphasizes complexity and opportunity gain. And what we found is that actually across using these different weights, there's quite a strong overlap. 18 out of the top 20 products are repeated across these three weights. And so that suggests that looking at those top 20 products is fine. We've got a good top 20, I suppose. Just in terms of, I mean, I've got the list there, but let's just look at it in terms of the product space. And what you have is, so these are chemicals and rubbers and plastics, okay? A lot of machinery products, so other engines, engine parts, harvesting machinery, vehicle parts, construction vehicles, and a lot of the machinery is related to agriculture and mining, which is quite interesting given that we have this sort of strong primary product basis in our economy. And then there's sort of metal products. This one over here is rock wool. And then there's some agri-processing. In particular, we look at pig and poultry fats, and then that goes into sausages and processed meats. Okay, so I want to get to the capabilities. So I'm just going to skip a bit of this, we haven't done all of the products, but I think this gives a good idea of where we're going with like thinking about capabilities and policy linkages. So this product that we're interested in here is pig and poultry fat, and that's used in your downstream processing of sausages, ham, and salami. Now, pork is it's the most consumed meat in the world, and it's sort of as income grows, your consumption of pork grows. South Africa's production is relatively small relative to your big producers in Brazil, US, EU, and China. And then the way that we look at it, and that's based on the information that we were getting from our firm interviews and our industry experts, is that we look at through the lens of a pork value chain. We don't do that for all of the products, but for pork, it just seemed to make sense that if you grow the entire value chain, you've got to grow the processed product that you're interested in. And what's quite interesting that came out is that there's a large market in India and China. I mean, China exports a lot of pork, but it also demands a lot. So came across that there's a big export opportunity in these very large economies. But if you want to enter these markets, you've got to grow scale and volume, and that seems to be something that's a challenge. Okay, so this is the value chain. Very simply, you've got your inputs. So think of feed. Okay, so you've got to have the feed for your pigs when they're produced. This is your primary breeder operation. So that you grow the pigs, and this is highly scientific. You adjust the genetics so that you maximize on the product that you generate. Sounds very weird when you speak about pigs as products, but that's how the industry works. So you have the breeding, weaning, and finishing of your pigs, and then that goes to the abattoir, and you can have some fresh meat exports, or the fresh meat goes into wholesale, then into retailers, or it goes into the processing industry, which can either go into local or international markets. Now, what was identified is that there's a number of constraints to this. For instance, over here, what the producers were saying, or the firms, was that in order to be globally competitive, you need to have R&D, because this process here, the breeding of pigs, as I said, it's highly scientific. You need to, they go in terms, they change the genetics so that you change the fat content of the meat so that you maximize the meat component relative to the fat component. I mean, it's fascinating stuff when you get into it, at least for me. But, it's really complex and detailed. And what South Africa, the R&D is just not enough. I mean, in Europe and in the US, they have entire farms dedicated to R&D, and they sort of scientifically measure what's, production and efficiencies. Your feed costs. So South Africa is a net exporter of soya beans, but we do not have the crushing capabilities to make that into a protein that goes into the feed. Okay? This is quite a big one here. I'm just going to go speak to the biosecurity. So this whole process, going from the production to the abattoir to the processing, you've got to have high levels of biosecurity. So for instance, with your producers, you have compartmentalized farms where all the pigs will be on one farm. They're separated into compartments, and in that case, that minimizes the risk of disease spread, and you also got to be able to follow the meat through the value chain, and then you can record back back where if there is a problem, a disease, then you can link it back to the source. So that whole process, it's the institution, I suppose, that needs to be in place. Now this becomes a problem with trade protocols, because if you don't have the institutions with the veterinary experts to make sure that your breeders, your abattoirs and your processors are following the due process, you can't get accreditation for exports. If you can't get the accreditation for exports, there's no incentive to grow scale. So it's sort of this idea that you've got to get that right. And that comes into sort of the way we're thinking about the policy framework, or policies we think divide into short run, long run, micro and macro. And the story really here is that in terms of firms, there is an existing framework for them to, a set of to-dos that will ensure, biosecurity. Basically, that's, this is, I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to leave it there. We can talk about this in questions, I suppose. Yeah. Okay. Do you want to chair now?
Yeah, so I'll be a self-imposed chair for this session. Give him a round of applause for the detailed presentation. Yeah, so questions?
I think that this work is really interesting. The fact that you've done it across the 4 countries and all worked together to do it is amazing. But I mean, the pork example is probably not a great one, just because, I don't know, the concept of creating jobs in order to, like you want all the genetics, that there's so much controversy around that. I kind of wonder, maybe there's another industry you want to choose. Like, I'm just playing the kind of, if you give this to another audience, it might come across as,
Okay, yeah, I agree. I mean,
you should use the wine example. Everyone would love that.
Well, we produce wine pretty well. But I mean, there's a few examples. But that one was, I went to most of the firm interviews, so it was closest to the heart. But I mean, it's also, you feel awkward in like audiences where, it's not really, pork's not a very favored product. But I mean, part of the story is also just like, for instance, we've got a product like rubber sheets, and we went to firms and they import the rubber sheets, and then they produce products that feed into motor vehicle parts and all of that. And so you have the product, and the analytics generate that, but you got to critique the analytics, and that's another important part of this, is actually saying, well, in the case of rubber sheets, it's not feasible, and we rather import that, and there's a lot of downstream products that go into motor vehicle parts, and that's one of the products. I'm just trying to think of examples. I don't think I can do it off the cuff at the moment, but I take your points. I should think about that carefully. Okay, well, thank you to those who attended.
Thank you for attending.